Hey patrons, what's going on? It is Friday. We've got another edition of Mosher's Mailbag. Had some very good questions that were asked to me last or throughout the week. In fact, I got a nice little late surge here on Thursday and Friday to some good questions. So, not going to really waste any time, and we're going to go right at it. Obviously, the Carson Wentz story that came out Monday in Philly Voice is still on a lot of people's minds. I wrote about it this week. Gave my thoughts on what the story meant, but we still have some questions that I'll be happy to go through right now. First one comes from Michael R. And he asks in particular about that Carson Wentz story. He says, "Isn't assertiveness what you would want in a franchise quarterback? Even if it rubs teammates and coaches the wrong way." The answer to that is mostly yes and sometimes no. I think I mentioned in the story that I wrote about the Carson Wentz story that if you Google Aaron Rodgers selfish or Russell Wilson selfish or some other quarterbacks, Brett Favre, attitude, you will find stories about these guys being difficult to work with or being called not a great leader or playing favorites or somebody had a problem with somebody. The Seattle defense had a problem with Russell Wilson. Jermichael Finley had a problem with Aaron Rodgers. The Ravens defense had an issue, or Ray Lewis had an issue with Joe Flacco not being, loud enough in the huddle or more excitable enough. And, these guys are all that I mentioned Super Bowl winning quarterbacks. So as I mentioned, no matter who you are, somebody's going to have it out for you. And to get back to the question though, is assertiveness, isn't that what you want? Yeah, of course you want assertiveness. I think you want a guy who believes he's great, who has a drive to be the best that he can be. And certainly Carson Wentz is mentioned in that kind of category as people who are just relentless and determined in their pursuit to become excellent. There was also a line in the story that said that he bullied, an anonymous source said he bullied Mike Groh. It's a very strong word, and I would have liked to have seen in that story maybe an example of what the source meant by bullying, because that's a pretty strong word. That's not something you'd want to see from your franchise quarterback. You don't want to see someone who's so confrontational and so hard-headed that he only thinks his way is the way that works. So this is a roundabout way of me getting to a different point. I think that the Eagles should probably consider bringing in, they have to replace their wide receivers coach anyway. Gunter Brewer is no longer with the team. So they have an opening there. I think they have to seriously consider bringing in someone on their offensive staff with some NFL experience, with a history of working with quarterbacks. It's clear that Carson had his best year under Reich, DiFilippo, Peterson, which is just an unbelievable quarterback room to work with, a quarterback trio to work with. Well, Reicher's not here. DiFilippo's not here. Both of those guys challenged him in different ways. I think DiFilippo was more of a tough love guy, challenged him to get better. Reich was a quarterback who could relate to him playing in the NFL. So he doesn't have that anymore. He's got Doug Peterson, but Mike Groh is not a former quarterback, and Press Taylor is only about 6 years older than Carson Wentz. I'm sure there are a couple names out there. You saw that Scott Linehan was released by the Cowboys. There's Marty Mornhinweg, who became the odd man out in Baltimore because they went with Greg Roman to redesign their offense around Lamar Jackson. I'm not suggesting that they bring in Scott Linehan or Marty Mornhinweg, but I do think it might be a good idea to bring in a veteran offensive coach, perhaps one who may have even played quarterback, to challenge Carson Wentz and hold him accountable in a way that he probably wasn't held this past year. And listen, they may have been different in coaching Carson Wentz this past year because they also knew he was coming back from a knee injury. But I do think that when you look at the current offensive staff, Doug Peterson has a lot on his plate as a head coach. It's really helpful if he has some senior assistants who play that position, if they're able to bring one in. Michael also asks, where do the Eagles look for a workhorse running back? Now, I wrote that on, I believe, Thursday, that they need a running back. They can't continue to go on with these committees. People have said that Doug Peterson prefers a committee because that's all they've seen in his 3 years. I can assure you he does not prefer a committee and would not like to go into different games wondering who's going to be his primary ball carrier. So I do think running back is one of the top 2 or 3 needs for the Eagles going into this offseason. The question Michael asks is where do they find him? It's a really good question because this is not a great draft for running backs, certainly not like the last few years where you've seen guys like Kareem Hunt and Alvin Kamara, Jordan Howard go in rounds 3 and 4. They're going to probably have to be creative. It doesn't mean there's not a good 3 down running back in this draft. So if they can get one in the first 3 rounds and it's a fit and it's somebody who works, then they really absolutely should take a look at it because they've kind of, and listen, like, 2 years ago, they went and took Sidney Jones in the 2nd round and Rasul Douglas in the 3rd round. And because of that, they missed out on Kamara. They missed out on Dalvin Cook. They missed out on Kareem Hunt. But nobody would argue 2 years ago that cornerback was such an extreme need for the Eagles. They had Leotis McKelvin and Nolan Carroll, and Jalen Mills was just a rookie. So it was completely understandable why they went and really addressed the corner position that they had failed to address for several years. But at this point, running back is like corner now. They need a running back. Free agency is difficult. There'll be guys out there. Mark Ingram is one. Dion Lewis is another. They're veterans, and I really still think the Eagles need a young guy that they can build around. So I don't know how they're going to do it. There'll be some names out there. I think the draft is their best solution, and we'll see if they can get themselves in position to draft a 3-down running back. They certainly put a lot of homework into many of the running backs that have come out over the last 3 years. Just haven't been able to find that guy. Haven't been able to use the draft pick at that time on the guy they want, except for, of course, trading up for Donnell Pumphrey, which now looks like a colossal mistake. Frank G asked me about 7 questions. Frank, you know that I try to answer as many of your questions as possible, so I picked the 3 ones that I felt most comfortable answering right now. The first is, will Chris Long be back? This is really dicey because I don't think it's a simple question of do the Eagles want him back or not. I mean, I think, yes, they want him back. They have an option. His contract is a little strange, and from what I was able to ascertain, the last 3 years of his deal starting next year were voidable. So he could technically become a free agent, I believe, if the Eagles opt out. If he's on the team, I believe he's going to have a cap figure of about, checking now, $3.5 million base salary. So it's going to be $5.6 million. Now, $5.6 million is probably on the upper end for a rotational defensive end, but that's another thing that Chris has talked about. Even though he's, I believe, 32 years old, Chris has said that he feels like he's in the, sort of the prime of his career. I'm sorry, 34 years old. He feels like he's in the prime of his career, and he almost seems to indicate that he'd like to play more than the 50 to 55% of the snaps that he's been playing. So it may be a case where the Eagles don't want him back at that price, and he would like to go somewhere anyway and get to play more, which I would say good luck to him to find a place that's going to play him more than situational at that age, but you never know. But what I meant by how it might not even be a case of whether the Eagles want him back or not, it may have to do with where the Eagles go from here with their other defensive linemen. I mean, Brandon Graham could walk out the door and be as a free agent, and he will be a free agent, and he may not be back. We'll have to see. Haloti Ngata, Tim Jernigan, they're kind of, one's a free agent, Ngata, and Jernigan, none of his money is guaranteed, and they have to see if they want to bring him back at $11 million. Derek Barnett and Josh Sweat are coming off injuries. I don't know how much the Eagles want to lose on this defensive line, and if they lose Brandon Graham, and if they, lose a couple other guys, and with Barnett coming off the injury, they may feel that they really need Chris Long. And Chris has played really well at his age. I understand why he wants to play more and why he thinks he's playing good football. So if they lose a bunch of guys and don't see themselves bringing him back, then you might see the Eagles say, all right, we can afford $6 million to bring about $5-6 million to bring back Chris Long because we're moving on from Brandon Graham. So I think all of that is going through the meetings right now, and I think it's kind of a wait and see approach, and we'll have to see whether those years on the contract are voided and he's a free agent or if he's back at that price. Frank asked about the Wentz article. Will that affect him? I think it might. I think that if Carson was already a guy who was pressing this past year because of the injury and because his backup won the Super Bowl, and I do believe he was pressing, and I think it was obvious when you watched him play, then certainly an article like this that calls him everything under the sun and has teammates kind of throwing him under the bus, yeah, I could see them having an adverse effect on him. I could also see it making him more determined, but if because he feels that way, he is more pressing more, then that could impact his play. So I would be concerned about an adverse effect. I know the writer Joe Santaliquito went on, I believe WIP, and said, "Hey, I'm the best thing now to happen to Carson because he's going to read this and he's going to want to prove everybody wrong." Well, there's that side to it too. I tend to think Carson is what he is. He's going to be a very good quarterback. He's going to get healthy eventually, and hopefully he stays healthy. And if he does, if he's healthy, has an off season, I really don't think we'll be talking about that story much come next August and September. And I don't think he lost the locker room. Normally in a case like that, there are a few people that come out and say things. They might be bitter, they might be jealous, but I felt like there were enough people, locker room leaders, that came out on Twitter or social media to defend Carson, that he has not lost the locker room. I think if you asked everybody in that locker room who they would rather have as their quarterback, Carson Wentz or somebody else, more than 80% would say Carson Wentz. Kevin W.S., should the Eagles do their diligence on Kareem Hunt? I would say, yeah. I mean, we just talked about how badly they need a 3-down running back like Kareem Hunt, a guy who can run, a guy who can catch, a guy who can pick up the blitz and do everything. And you saw the impact that he had on the Chiefs offense. Now, it doesn't mean they just go out and sign him. I think they have to do a lot of homework. But one thing I think everybody has to remember is that Kareem Hunt has yet to be suspended by the NFL. So even if you bring in Kareem Hunt, you're not going to be able to work him right away. He's going to wind up missing, I'm going to assume at least 2 to 3 games, maybe up to 6, 7. Kareem Hunt, which is, again, why I think, yeah, you do your diligence, but if you have an opportunity to get a running back through the draft that you can develop right away from the start, you go that route. Patrick K talks about Howie and says he loves the job that Howie's done with the contracts, with the cap, which is a good point. He's done an excellent job. But he asks, will Joe Douglas leave for a GM job somewhere else, and will Howie be able to replace him? That's kind of been one of the most under-discussed storylines of the past year, because last year at this time, the Eagles blocked him from interviewing, I believe, from the Houston Texans GM job. And normally when you do that, when you block a guy and you keep him, then you reward him. You give him a pay raise and make him feel happy even after you block him. I don't know that the Eagles did that. I've heard different things about what they've done, but he's here now. And normally moves like that happen after the draft. So there's no way Joe Douglas is going anywhere from now. But after the draft, when teams look to hire GMs or fire GMs and replace with new ones, you may hear Joe Douglas's name come up. And the question will be does Joe want to be GM in title? The Eagles can keep giving him salary raise, and they might be able to pay him as much as most GMs. But if he wants that title, then it's going to be difficult, because I don't think Howie is stepping aside anytime soon. But from what I understand, Joe Douglas is in complete control of the scouting staff. That is his scouting staff. In fact, what I was told was Howie Roseman didn't even go to the Senior Bowl. So he may not be GM, but he's got his hand in personnel decisions, both pro personnel and college personnel decisions, as much as anyone other than Howie. So he's kind of like assistant GM with his title, even though his title, I believe, is vice president of player personnel. The money he makes, probably consistent with an assistant GM. If he's looking, though, to be that guy who is in sole control of a franchise, then I think the concern is legit that he might go somewhere else. I haven't seen any reports of anybody firing their GMs lately. So for now, I think that's good. So if you're rooting for Joe Douglas to stay, root for no major front office upheaval on other teams in the next month or two. I know there were a lot of coaching changes, but I don't believe there were a lot of GM changes. But again, sometimes you'll see 2 or 3 right after the draft. So we'll talk about that more after the draft. And I'll try to get a little bit more information about whether or not he at least gotten a pay bump after they blocked him from interviewing last year. Last question is from Keith W., and he asks, does Carson Wentz get a new contract this offseason? I believe he does. I believe the Eagles are going to say that it is better to get him extended now than next year or the year after. I know about the injuries. I know about the year he just had, but we all know that the price for quarterbacks goes up year after year after year. So if you sign him now, that means you're not adding on millions upon millions in 2019 or 20 or 21. They've already declared that he's their quarterback going forward. So there's no reason not to give him an extension right now. I know some people say, well, let him stay healthy, or let him have another great year, or you've got him under control. But remember, every time you do that, then you get closer to free agency, or you get two or three other quarterbacks who sign extensions, and that lifts the number overall that you're going to have to pay. I think the Eagles would rather have to pay him now than a year from now or 2 years from now when the number's even bigger. So to me, what the Eagles will likely do is give him an extension, and they may be able to work some incentives in it based on staying healthy and playing time that could alleviate them from some of the guaranteed money if he were to miss time with an injury. So now's probably the best time because you might be able to get that into a contract as opposed to if he plays 16 games next year, then you're trying to extend him and he says, no, I'm not going to take any staying healthy clauses. I just played a 16 game season. So at the end of the day, that's my answer is saying, yes, I think Carson Wentz will get an extension this year and it'll probably be in that 28 to $30 million annual neighborhood. All right. Hope everybody has a great weekend. That's it for Mosher's Mailbag. And of course, I will talk to you next week. And thanks again for being patrons and reading and loyally interacting. It's always fun. Take care.